I watched the blood drain out of my aunt's face in real time, and I will be honest with you, after 16 years, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. A minute earlier, she'd been laughing on the phone in the lobby of Hawthorne House, the assisted living place she owned, the one where I scrubbed bedpans and refilled creamer dispensers for $13 an hour. She had on the camel coat she wore when investors came by. Then the front doors opened and a small, straight-backed old woman walked in out of the snow, and my aunt stopped mid-sentence and went the color of the wall. The old woman set down her purse, looked at her for a long moment, and said quietly, "Hello, Marlene. You told me the fire took her along with my son. She's been pouring your residents their coffee for 2 years." I laughed. I actually laughed because it was such a strange thing to say, and I figured the poor woman was confused. Half my residents were. I started to walk her toward the sitting room. Then she turned to me, and her eyes were wet and steady at the same time. And she said, "You don't know me, sweetheart, but I've been looking for you since the night you were 16 years old. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I was before that morning. My name is Della. I'm 28. And for most of my adult life, I have been what you'd politely call scraping by. I grew up in Concord, New Hampshire, in a small house that always smelled like my mother's instant coffee and the wood stove that never quite heated the back rooms. My dad, Caleb, fixed boilers for a living. My mom, Dawn, did the books for a dentist. We weren't rich, but I was loved so loudly I never noticed we weren't. Then, the winter I was 16, our house burned down with both of them inside it. Faulty wiring in the wall behind the stove, the report said. I was sleeping over at a friend's because I'd had a fight with my mom about a curfew. A stupid, ordinary fight, and that's the only reason I'm alive to tell you any of this. I have spent a lot of years carrying the guilt of being mad at her on the last night she breathed. After the funerals, my aunt took me in. My father's older sister, Marlene. I barely knew her. She and my dad hadn't spoken much when I was little, some family rift no one explained to a kid. But she showed up at the service in a black coat that cost more than my dad made in a month, and she put her hand on my shoulder and said she'd take care of everything now. And God help me, I believed her. Because what else does a 16-year-old with no parents do? She did take care of things. The lawyers, the estate, the insurance, the paperwork. She told me my parents had been deeper in debt than anyone knew. The boiler business was failing, there were credit cards, a second mortgage. When the dust settled, she said, my share of everything came to $20,000. She put it in an account for college and told me she'd manage it until I was ready. She also told me, gently, the way you tell a child a goldfish died, that there was no one else. My mom had been an only child whose parents had passed. And my dad's mother, my grandmother, had died years before the fire. There'd been some falling out, she said. My dad cut his own mother off when he married my mom, and they never reconciled. And then the old woman died alone and bitter, and that was that. It's just us now, my aunt said, squeezing my hand. We're all the family either of us has left. I believed every single word. Why wouldn't I? You don't fact-check your own grief. The $20,000 was gone by the time I was 19, community college tuition, a deposit on an apartment, a used Corolla, the regular leaks a poor life springs on you. I dropped out a semester short because I couldn't cover the next bill, and after that I just worked. Diners, a call center. Stocking shelves overnight at a grocery store, which is a special kind of lonely. I moved between apartments that got smaller each time. I learned which gas stations had the cheapest coffee and which laundromat let the dryers run a little long. Meanwhile, my aunt's life got bigger and shinier every year. She'd taken her own modest savings, that's what she always called them, my modest savings, and opened Hawthorne House, a pretty assisted living residence with a fountain in the courtyard and a waiting list. Then a second building. She drove a Lexus the color of a pearl. She had a lake house up near Winnipesaukee. At Thanksgiving, she'd make a little speech about how proud our family would be, and I'd nod and pass the rolls and feel like the poor relation who'd been invited out of duty. When I was 26, she offered me a job. She said Hawthorne needed dependable people and she wanted family clothes. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but it came with a feeling I'd been starving for. that I belonged somewhere, that my aunt was finally lifting me up. I want you to understand what I actually did there, because it matters later. I was the one who learned which resident liked her tea with exactly 1.5 sugars. I sat with a man named Mr. Petrakis the night his wife passed, holding his hand for 3 hours because no one else came. I was good at it. I loved the old people in that building in a way I never had words for. And every 2 weeks, the employee of the month frame in the break room got a new face that was never mine. And every 2 weeks, I told myself I didn't mind. I didn't know yet that the building I was breaking my back inside had been built on the ashes of my parents' house. Literally. We'll get there. If you're already feeling something in your chest, do me a small kindness and tap subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read all of them. Now let me tell you about the spit test. It started with a stupid birthday gift. The previous spring, one of my coworkers, a sweet woman named Marisol, gave everybody on our floor those mail-in DNA kits she'd gotten on clearance. We spat in little tubes at lunch and laughed about it. Mine came back with the ethnicity breakdown you'd expect and a list of DNA relatives I scrolled past because what did I care? I had no family but my aunt. Then, that October, I got an email. The app had flagged a new match. At the top, in bold, 2 words that made my coffee go cold in my hand: close family, grandmother. A 98% confidence match to a woman whose username was just initials. I figured it was a glitch. My grandmother was dead. My aunt had told me 100 times. I closed the email. A message came through the app 2 days later. It was careful, almost shy. It said the writer believed we might be related, that she had lost her son and his child in a house fire many years ago, and that the dates and the location lined up in a way she could not ignore. She asked very simply if my father's name had been Caleb. I sat on the floor of my apartment with my back against the radiator and read that message about 40 times. I didn't answer for a week. I was terrified, not of a scam, but of hope. Because if she was real, then something my aunt had told me wasn't. I never got to finish deciding what to do because the storm decided for me. It was the first real snow of the year, the kind that turns Concord into a snow globe somebody shook too hard. I'd missed the early bus and was walking the long way to my evening shift when I saw an old woman near the corner of Pleasant Street gripping a parking meter with both hands. A bag of groceries had split at her feet and oranges were rolling into the gutter. And she was just standing there, frozen, the way the very elderly get when the ground is ice and their hips remember every fall they've ever taken. I did what I do for any of my residents. I gathered her oranges, I got under her arm, and I walked her the 4 blocks to where she said she was staying. She was sharp as a tack, that one. She made a dry joke about how the city must save money by salting the roads with snow instead of salt, and by the time we got to the little inn on the corner, I was laughing and half in love with her the way you fall a little in love with kind old strangers. She asked what I did. I told her I worked at Hawthorne House. Something moved across her face, just for a second, and I figured she had a friend there, or a bad memory of a place like it. She said she'd actually been thinking about touring a residence for herself, that she had no business living alone anymore at her age, and would it be all right if she stopped by where I worked the next day? I said of course. I told her to ask for me. I gave her my name. Her hand tightened on mine just slightly, and she said, "Della, that's a good name." And then she went inside and I went to work, and I had absolutely no idea I had just walked my own grandmother home. She came the next afternoon at 3. I was restocking the coffee station when the doors opened, and that's where you came in. My aunt going white, the camel coat, the line about the fire. What I didn't tell you yet is what happened in the 10 minutes after. My grandmother, her name is Edith Linden, and she is the toughest person I have ever met, did not make a scene. That part matters, and I'll tell you why. She did not stand in that lobby and shout 16 years of crimes in front of the staff and the residents. She looked at my aunt and said very low, "Not here." The girl deserves to hear it sitting down, not in a hallway. And then she asked me, gently, if I would come have coffee with her at the inn when my shift ended. My aunt tried. Lord, she tried. She put a hand on my arm and said the woman was clearly senile, that there'd been a misunderstanding, that she'd handle it. But I had spent 2 years watching my aunt handle confused old women, and this was the first time I'd ever seen her hand shake doing it. I told her I was taking my break. I walked out the staff door into the cold, and I did not go back in. I want to be honest about something, because the comments on stories like mine always catch it. I did not go back to work the next day and pretend everything was normal. People always ask how you could possibly act fine after a thing like that, and the answer is you can't, and I didn't even try. I called in sick. Then I called in sick again. By the end of the week, I'd stopped calling at all. Whatever was coming, I was done fetching that woman's coffee. But that first night, I sat across from my grandmother in a booth at the inn, and she laid it out, and the floor of the world dropped away. My grandmother had not died before the fire. She'd been alive the whole time, in a town 2 hours away, mourning a son she'd lost touch with, and a granddaughter she was told had died beside him. The falling out between her and my dad had been real but small. A fight about money when my parents first married, the kind of fight families have and forgive, except they ran out of time to forgive it. After the fire, my aunt had come to her mother weeping, the prodigal daughter, and told her that Caleb and his little girl had both burned. Both of us. My grandmother grieved 2 coffins, one of them mine. And then my aunt stayed. For 16 years she played the devoted, only surviving child. She visited my grandmother on holidays. She drove her to doctors. She told her she worked in elder care, but never once said the words Hawthorne House, never let the 2 halves of her life touch. She steered my grandmother into changing her will twice, until Marlene was the sole heir. She borrowed against my grandmother's affection in small bites, a loan here, a gift there, that added up over the years to more than $300,000. And she was, my grandmother told me, weeks away from getting power of attorney signed. I started to doubt her about a year ago, my grandmother said, turning her coffee cup in slow circles, little things that didn't add up. So I did one of those spit tests, the kind everyone's doing. I told myself I was looking for cousins. I don't know what I was really looking for. Her voice cracked for the first time. And then there you were, a grandmother match, a granddaughter who was supposed to be Ash. She'd hired a private investigator the same day. It took him 3 weeks to find me, to find that the dead granddaughter was alive and well and emptying wastebaskets in her own aunt's building. My grandmother said she'd planned to approach me carefully, gently after the holidays. She had meant for it to happen on an icy corner over a bag of oranges. But maybe that was right, she said. Maybe I needed to know what kind of person you were before you knew who I was. And you stopped for an old woman in the snow when you had nowhere warm to be yourself. Then she asked me the question that broke me clean in half. What did Marlene tell you the estate was worth, child? I said $20,000. I said there'd been all that debt. She set her cup down very carefully, like she was afraid of dropping it. Your father carried a life insurance policy through his union, she said. I know because I helped him fill out the paperwork before you were born, and he never let it lapse. It was worth $400,000. The land your house sat on sold for $200,000. There were savings bonds your grandfather left for you specifically in trust the year you were born. She looked at me. There was no debt, Della. Your parents were careful people. By the time you turned 18, you should have had close to $700,000. I'm going to be honest with you about my first thought because it's the kind of small, stupid, human thing nobody admits. I didn't think about the houses I could have bought or the degree I could have finished. I thought about every single time I'd microwaved the same can of lentil soup for dinner 3 nights running and told myself it was fine. I thought about crying in a gas station bathroom because the Corolla needed a $400 repair I couldn't make. $700,000 had been sitting in the world the whole time with my name on it, and I'd been counting quarters for the dryer. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I dug out the 1 box of my parents' things I carried apartment to apartment for 12 years and never had the heart to open. My aunt had handed it to me after the funerals, just keepsakes, she'd said. Photos, my mom's reading glasses, a church cookbook, and at the very bottom, my mother's worn leather address book. I turned the L's, and there it was in my mom's round handwriting, not crossed out, not erased, Edith Linden, with an address 2 hours south and a phone number. My grandmother. Alive on paper the whole time, in a book my aunt had handed me herself, never imagining I'd open it. I sat on the floor until the radiator clanked awake at dawn, and somewhere in there the grief turned into something colder and clearer. I picked up my phone and texted my grandmother 3 words. I found her. If this is gripping you, do me one favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. Okay, now things move fast. My grandmother had a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Lorraine Pike, who'd spent 30 years on probate and elder fraud cases and looked at the world like she'd seen every con a person could run on family. When she went through what we had, she didn't waste breath being gentle. Your aunt, she said, is going to spend a long time in a place with no fountain in the courtyard. She pulled the guardianship records from when I was 16. That's where it got worse than even my grandmother knew. When I was a minor, my aunt had petitioned the court for control of my parents' estate as my guardian, routine enough. But she'd also filed documents the year I turned 18, transferring the remaining trust assets to herself, signed with my name. I never signed them. I'd never even seen them. She had forged the signature of a teenager, too, gutted by grief to read her own mail, and she'd done it cleanly enough to fool a busy clerk. That $400,000 insurance payout had gone into an account my aunt controlled. The land money, the bonds, all of it routed the same way. After paying off the funeral costs and a few small genuine bills, she'd kept somewhere north of $600,000. And that money Lorraine traced had been the modest savings that built Hawthorne House, the fountain, the waiting list, the pearl-colored Lexus. Every cent of it had started as my parents' last gift to me. Lorraine laid out the options the way you'd lay out roads on a map. We could sue, drag it through civil court for years, and maybe recover money. Or we could take everything to the state and the county and let the criminal side handle it. Fraud, forgery, theft, and, because of what she'd done to my grandmother, financial exploitation of an elder, which in our state is its own serious felony. If we do it right, Lorraine said, she doesn't just pay you back. She loses the whole thing. My grandmother and I both said the same word at the same time. We wanted the whole thing. But Lorraine told us to be patient and quiet for a few weeks while she built it airtight bank records, the forged filings, my grandmother's gift histories, statements from the residents' books. Don't tip her off, she said. Don't confront her. Don't argue with her. Don't post anything. Just go dark. That part I could do easily because I'd already gone dark. I never went back to Hawthorne. I told a few coworkers I trusted that I had a family emergency, which was the truest thing I'd ever said. I crashed at my grandmother's inn, then at the little house she rented near Lorraine's office, and for the first time since I was 16, somebody made me breakfast and asked how I'd slept. What I didn't know was how much Lorraine's go dark would uncover once she got into Hawthorne's books, because to subpoena those records, she had to involve the state's Elder Affairs Office, and once they started pulling threads, the whole sweater came apart. My aunt hadn't only stolen from me and from her own mother. She'd been quietly skimming from the residents. It turned out several Hawthorne families had been overbilled for years, care surcharges, and facility fees that went into accounts that had nothing to do with the residents' care. A widower with dementia had been charged for a private aide he never had. An estate of a woman who died the previous spring was short $11,000 no one could account for. There was a man, a silent investor named Gideon, who'd put money into the second building and never looked at the ledgers. And when the forensic accountant showed him what was in them, he turned the rest over to the authorities himself before they could ask, terrified of going down with her. The arrest came on a Tuesday afternoon. I know because Lorraine called me at 2:50 and told me it was happening, and I sat on my grandmother's borrowed couch and stared at the clock until my eyes blurred. 2 detectives walked into the lobby of Hawthorne House, the same lobby, and asked for Marlene Linden. They read her rights in front of the fountain. A co-worker who was there told me later that my aunt kept her chin up and her professional smile on, the way she always did, right up until they said the words elder financial exploitation, and then the smile finally fell off her face and didn't come back. I wasn't there. I thought I'd want to be, but when the moment came, I found I didn't need to watch her in handcuffs to feel free. I was sitting in a warm room with my grandmother, who reached over without a word and held my hand while we waited for the call that said it was done. After that, it all collapsed the way rotten things do. Slowly, then all at once. Her assets froze. The lake house got a notice taped to the door. The Pearl Lexus went onto a flatbed in front of the residence where she'd parked it like a trophy for years. Her license to operate a care facility was pulled within a week, and Hawthorne was handed to a court-appointed administrator so the residents wouldn't be turned out into the cold. The investigation widened the way they do. In the end, the state counted more than a dozen people she'd cheated, and every name added another charge. The trial took 3 weeks. I sat in that courtroom every single day, and so did my grandmother, who was 79 and refused a wheelchair on principle. I watched my aunt try the only move she'd ever known, the warm, reasonable, trust-me smile she'd used to charm a grieving teenager and a lonely old woman and a courtroom full of families. But there was nobody left in that room who believed her. The forged signature was on a screen 10 feet tall. The residents' families testified. My grandmother testified, her voice never shaking once, about a daughter who told her 2 people were dead so she could inherit a third person's love. And I testified about being 16 and signing nothing and trusting everything. When the foreman stood to read it, I made myself look at her face. 22 counts. Guilty on everyone. The judge had no softness left in his voice. He called her a predator who'd hidden behind the word family, who'd stolen from the dead and the grieving and the very old. And he gave her 29 years. She's 51. She'll be an old woman herself in a state facility before she sees a parole board. Older by then than most of the residents she robbed. The court ordered full restitution. Everything she built got liquidated and given back. The residents' families were made whole. My grandmother got back the money that had been peeled off her over 16 years, and her will restored to her own wishes. And I received the inheritance that should have been mine at 18, the principal and years of interest both, a little over $800,000. I want to tell you it felt like winning. Mostly it felt like exhaling for the first time in a decade. Here's the part the world never shows you, the part after the verdict. I didn't buy a big house or a flashy car. I traded in the Corolla, which by then was held together with hope and zip ties, for a sensible little Honda with all-wheel drive, and I swear, every time it starts on the first try in a Concord January, I grin like a fool. I finished my degree, night classes, on my own schedule, with no one to thank but myself, and then I did the only thing that ever made sense to me. I started a small in-home care service. Honest, transparent, no surcharge nonsense, the opposite of everything Hawthorne had become. I named it Linden House Care, after my father's family. After the grandmother I'd been told to forget. It's not big. It's me and 3 caregivers and a handful of clients across the county, old people who want to stay in their own kitchens with their own mugs. Mr. Petrakis was my first client. He cried when I showed up at his door in a polo shirt with the Linden House logo on it, and so did I, a little. My grandmother and I have Sundays now. I drive the 2 hours south and we have supper, and she tells me about my dad as a boy, that he could fix anything, that he was stubborn, that he loved my mother so completely it scared his whole family. It turns out I'm not alone the way I was told. There are cousins, my grandmother's brother's grandchildren, scattered across 2 states, and over that first year I met them one by one, a wedding here and a backyard barbecue there, a whole family I was told had never existed. I took my father's name back too, quietly, at the courthouse. No ceremony. Della Linden. It fit better than anything I'd worn in years. About 8 months after the sentencing, a letter came to me from a state correctional facility. My aunt's handwriting on the envelope. That same confident slant. I sat with it on my porch for a while, then I opened it because I'm human. She wrote that she was sorry, that she'd made mistakes, that prison had changed her, that I was the only family she had left, and surely family forgives. She asked for money for commissary and for an appeal. I read it twice. Then I tore it into small pieces and let the wind off the river take them. Some doors you close and then you take the hinges off the wall so they can't swing open again. A while after that, my phone rang at the office with a number I didn't know, and a recorded voice asked if I'd accept a collect call from a correctional facility. I thought about it for maybe 2 seconds, about the lentil soup, about Mr. Petrakas's wife, about my mother's address book at the bottom of a box, about an old woman gripping a parking meter in the snow. No, I said, I won't. And I hung up and I went back to scheduling next week's visits, building something small and slow and entirely my own. People ask me if I'd change the fight that I had with my mother on the last night, the curfew I broke that put me at a friend's house instead of in that fire. I used to wish I could take it back every single day. I don't anymore, because that broken curfew kept me alive long enough to walk an old woman home through the snow. An old woman who'd been searching for me for 16 years, who I'd have walked right past if I were the kind of person who didn't stop. So here is the only thing I know for certain after all of it: be kind to the strangers struggling on the corner, even when you've got nowhere warm to go yourself. You never know who's been looking for you your whole life, or how long they've been waiting for you to be the kind of person they hoped you'd grown into. For 16 years, I let one version of my own life stand because the person who told it to me was the only family I thought I had. That was my real mistake. Not that I trusted my aunt, but that I trusted her so completely I never once read my own mother's address book, never opened the box in my closet, never asked a single hard question. Marlene didn't win because she was clever. She won because grief made me soft in the one place I needed to stay sharp, and she knew it, and she lived off it for 16 years. I think about cause and effect a lot now. Every bad thing that happened to me traces back to a lie I never tested, and every good thing traces back to a small choice I made without thinking. The choice to stop for a stranger gripping a parking meter in the snow. Edith always says fate brought us together that night, but I don't believe that, not really. She'd been searching for me for a year. The investigator had already found me. What the snow gave us was the chance for her to see whether I was the kind of person worth fighting for, and I almost wasn't there to be seen because cold broke people walk past a lot of other cold people. Kindness wasn't an accident that night. It was a habit I built in a building full of old people nobody else sat with. So here's what I'd tell you if you were sitting across from me. Be the kind of person who does the decent thing even when no one's keeping score, because character is just the sum of what you do when it costs you something. But decency alone won't save you. It didn't save me for 16 years. You have to be willing to look, really look, at the stories you've been handed, even the ones told by people you love, especially those. Read the letter. Open the box. Ask the question that scares you. The truth doesn't punish you for checking, it only punishes you for refusing to. And when the truth finally comes, it asks something harder of you than tears. It asks you to keep going. I could have taken my $800,000 and disappeared into a quiet, comfortable, bitter little life. Plenty of people would have. Instead, I went back to the only work that ever made me feel useful, and I built something honest out of the ashes of something stolen. That took a kind of stubbornness I didn't know I had until I needed it, the refusal to let what Marlene did to me decide who I'd become. I'm not the coffee girl anymore, and I'm not the orphan who counted quarters for the dryer. I'm Della Linden, and I sleep fine at night, not because I got even, because I finally became someone my parents would recognize.